Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. This is where you can find extended versions of my interviews on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and on the pod today, we are looking at some of the biggest national security threats facing the United States, just as we head into a pretty contentious presidential election. Joining me, retired four-star U.S. Admiral and former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Jim Stavridis. As you might expect, Jim doesn't sugarcoat things, and he believes some of the biggest threats to U.S. national security are coming from, inside the House. Meanwhile, outside of the United States, there's plenty to keep the next commander-in-chief up at night, from a grinding war in Ukraine to a bloody conflict in Gaza, and then there's China. And one of the biggest unknowns in geopolitics today, what will Xi Jinping do about Taiwan? We will dive into all that and more. So let's get to it. Admiral Jim Stavridis, good to have you back on the show.
Great to be back with you.
There's so much to talk about. And usually you and I go around the world, but
Sure.
I kind of feel, given what's been happening in the United States, maybe we should start here at home.
Sure.
Threat environment in the U.S. I remember hearing from the head of national intelligence, from the head of the CIA, the biggest threats to the United States right now are here.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean to you?
Three things. One, domestic terrorism. We just recently had an assassination attempt on the former president of the United States. I think we're going to find that's an act of domestic terrorism, meaning it's some combination of unhinged political demonstration, young killer kind of thing. So internal domestic terror acts. Number two, threat actors. Clearly, we've seen Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, back in July, talking about all systems blinking red. And he's talking about, for example, a very porous southern border with indications that malactors are moving people across.
From all over the world.
All over the world, from the Middle East, from Latin America.
From China.
And certainly from China, certainly from the stands. So there's a physical external component. And then thirdly, you and I have talked quite a bit over the years, cyber and cyber activity. I think that's distinct from the first two because it's not as attributable. And so here in particular, I'd be watching China and Russia, great powers who have real capability. So Ian, I think those are the three threat vectors we ought to be mindful of. And oh, by the way, you may not know this, there's an election in the United States this year.
I was going to ask you.
So that's going to amp up the tendency of bad actors to do things because they know the spotlight is here.
What have you seen in this election cycle? Everyone is, of course, more unhinged this time around, but what have you seen specifically in the run-up to this election that gives you pause compared to previous U.S. elections?
Well, first, it's I think, very dramatic fork in the road on certain international issues. I think the most obvious is climate. So you've had a Trump administration that pulls out of the Paris Climate Accord, and deregulates significantly. Then we have now had 4 years of a Biden administration doing the opposite. And so I think, Ian, we're going to see very dramatic fork in the road between a Trump presidency and a Harris presidency in climate. I think, secondly, you're going to see pretty dramatic differences in how the two sides approach China. I think a Harris administration will be mindful of the challenges of China, but look more for opportunities to cooperate where we can, confront where we must. With a Trump administration, I think we're in for a pretty rough ride with China. So as I watch foreign policy, kind of our wheelhouse, I worry about that bifurcation of U.S. foreign policy. It makes us appear erratic, unwieldy, whichever side you favor coming into power.
Clearly the backdrop geopolitically to a challenging domestic U.S. threat environment is much more volatile and uncertain than anytime that I've been watching
Yeah,
politics. Maybe start with China, and actually start with some good news. On the South China Sea, which I know you and I watch very carefully, it appears that the Chinese recently have reached out to the Philippines to say we want to lower the temperature. Do you put any stock in that?
I kind of do, and I think it's the tactical versus the strategic. President Xi, above all, wants to get his economy moving. And he knows that a real confrontation, particularly in the Philippines, is going to be an impediment to doing that, both in a transactional way in the other nations of the South China Sea. Vietnam, right across the South China Sea, is watching this very closely. So there's a tactical transactional piece. And then secondly, Xi is very much aware that the Philippines are treaty allies of the United States.
So something bad happens, the Americans are obliged to defend.
Exactly. I think a lot of Americans think of the obligations we have to our NATO partners, and most Americans can tell you that we have a mutual defense treaty with Japan or Australia. I think very few Americans, also South Korea, also, however, Thailand and the Philippines. Not a lot of Americans are aware. Those are rock solid mutual defense treaties. So we may not know it here in the populace of the United States, but I assure you the Chinese are well aware of it. They know what that kind of confrontation could lead to. Xi wants to get his economy moving. He's not looking for a big confrontation. So yes, I do put stock in what's happening.
So in other words, there's the Scarborough Shoal, which has this ship that is falling apart, which the Philippines are trying to shore up, as it were. And there's been actual fighting between the Chinese and Philippine soldiers. There's been, I think, one soldier lost his thumb. Right? I mean, it's piracy kind of stuff, right? And so you're saying the Chinese are actively trying, and we should take them at their word, for the time being, they're trying to reduce the temperature.
100%. And that's the tactical action that's happening. Strategically, however, China is not going to back away from their preposterous claims of territoriality all around this vast body of water. Most Americans don't realize how big the South China Sea is. It's half the size of the United States. China claims almost all of it, the so-called 9 or 10-dash line. And within that, China is playing a very long game.
It goes from the Chinese coast, like right down to the territory of like the Philippines, Indonesia. It's kind of extraordinary what they claim.
Oh, it's huge. And 2 points to be made. One is, what guards the northern entrance to the South China Sea? Oh, it's this island called Taiwan. So it ups the stakes. We think correctly about Taiwan and its criticality in the world of microchips and its vibrant democracy. It's also geographically the door into the South China Sea. And the second point to be made about China's claims, they have been through the international courts, Ian, and thoroughly rejected. And the reason is China bases all their claims on the voyages of a Chinese admiral, Sheng Yi, 400 years ago. But they never claimed the territory. They never built outposts. They did nothing to establish real sovereignty. So their claims were rejected. And I think that they don't have a good case.
Now, Jim, on this point, the United States rejects all sorts of decisions from the International Court of Justice all the time when they don't like them.
Right.
And the U.S. is not a signatory. So I wonder, like, when you sit here and talk to me about the fact that farcical Chinese claims are getting rejected, do we have an ability as Americans to credibly talk about that sort of thing?
I think we do in a countervailing way. What China is doing, Ian, is effectively saying, it would be as though the United States said, we own the Gulf of Mexico. We own everything around it. We own that entire body of water. And we own it because American warships have passed through it over the years. It's a preposterous claim. We don't do that. We do walk the walk of the international system. Our territorial seas, as you well know, are 12 miles. There's another 12 miles of contiguous zone, and then there's a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. We follow those precepts. So I'm pretty confident in our moral authority in pointing this out.
You sound like you know a little something about the law of the seas.
I was the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and of course I wrote my PhD on the law of the sea, which I know you know.
I do know. I'm just
tweaking
giving
me.
you a hard
You're tweaking me, Dr. Bremmer.
Okay, now you teased Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't hit it yet. Does your view that China's economy and its deep structural challenges means that they don't want any trouble with the South China Sea right now? We know that Taiwan is an existential issue for Xi Jinping. Yeah. Does that also make him much more cautious in the way he is willing to escalate, or a level of risk aversion around a new Taiwanese government that he really dislikes and mistrusts?
He does. So I think this is a good example of where it's helpful to put yourselves in the shoes of the other actors. So let's put ourselves in Xi Jinping's shoes for a minute, because there's another word here. We talk about Taiwan. What else is Xi looking at? He's looking at Ukraine, and he's asking himself three things. On Ukraine, at the Olympics 2.5 years ago, his best friend forever, Vladimir Putin, whispered in his ear, you know, Xi, I'm going to take down that country. I'm going to sweep across it in 5 days. I'm going to grab that little knucklehead former comedian and throw him in prison for the rest of his life, or maybe I'll kill him. What happened? Well, they got stopped. So point one, President Xi is watching what happened in Ukraine and is asking himself, I wonder if my generals are as bad as those Russian generals appear to be. Putin's generals assured him they would conquer Ukraine. Of course, they have not. A lot of factors have gone into that. But that's uncertainty number one for Xi. His armed force, his Chinese military hasn't been in combat in a serious way since the Korean War. He doesn't have a general who started a shot fired in anger. For better or for worse, the American military is highly blooded. Yeah. So that's uncertainty number one, and he's watching Ukraine. Uncertainty number two, Xi says to himself, I wonder if those Taiwanese will fight like hell, the way that the Ukrainians have. He doesn't know. He's never been to Taiwan. I've been to Taiwan a fair amount. I think they'll fight. I think they'll fight hard. And that island is a resistance fighter's dream. It's wooded, mountainous. The Taiwanese have been tunneling it for decades. I think they'll fight and fight hard. It's
also an island, so it's amphibious.
Right? As I always say, you know, there's a reason people built moats around castles in the Middle Ages. Taiwan is surrounded by the biggest, baddest moat on Earth. It's 100 miles of really rough sea that I've sailed. So uncertainty number two is, how hard will the resistance be? I think it'll be hard. He doesn't know. Nobody knows. But number three, would he incur big sanctions the way that Russia has? And, you know, I think President Xi probably wakes up in the morning, looks in the mirror on that subject and says, my economy, it's too big to sanction, right? Yeah, it is pretty big economy, but could we hurt it badly with precision-guided sanctions, secondary sanctions? Yeah, it would crack the global economy. Let's hope we don't get there. But again, where we started this conversation, Ian, what's Xi's prime directive right now? He has to get his economy going. Attacking Taiwan doesn't get him. So
all of this is making you think that near term, at least, maybe near to medium term, the risks of confrontation with China are overstated.
Correct.
Yeah, and I mean, that's important because, you know, at the end of the day, I know you said that there's a difference, there's a fork in the road between a Harris presidency and Trump presidency. But I mean, I would argue that of all the places out there, China's the one that they've been most aligned on.
Yeah.
It's the easiest one to get like, you know, consensus in Congress on.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe we can dial down the temperature a little bit, given the nature of the Chinese economy.
I will part company with you with one word, which is tariff. The Trump team, at least thus far, has talked consistently.
They talk big.
Massive tariff. The Harris team, which is still being shaped even as we run this election, is much more amenable to finding a better path. I think that's where the big difference is between them. And I agree with you geopolitically. I think both sides, no one's looking for a war here.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.
So I want to move a little bit. I do want to talk to you a bit about the Middle East, in part because I see that there are a lot of inexpensive Houthi weapons that are being, shot down, defended against with much more expensive American equipment, UK equipment. I mean, to the extent that we keep trying to fight these asymmetrical wars, they're really, really not cost effective.
No.
And yet it seems that the Houthis are getting more and more capable at what they're able to do in the region. And this ragtag group has been able to disrupt shipping traffic for months now. So you as the Admiral, talk to me about what we need to be doing that we aren't doing.
I'll give you a 5-step campaign plan. We're one step into it, and it's the one you described. It's defense. It is ensuring that we can knock down those missiles, that we can respond when a Houthi piracy operation gets underway. And by the way, I spent 4 years fighting Somali pirates, right? Those were teenagers in flip-flops with rusty AK-47s. Maybe you've seen Captain Phillips. Okay, that's not the Houthis. The Houthis have been trained, equipped, organized by the Iranian, and particularly by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
The IRGC,
Google Houthi takedown of warship. You'll see a Navy SEAL-like operation, fully kitted out, high-tech communication, rope line down, incredibly capable.
So this is not Hamas with their GoPros, not at all.
No,
right.
This is a very well-equipped force on the maritime side. So what should we do? Number one, we defend, we put in convoys, we do all the at-sea things. Number two, we haven't done this yet in a serious way, you go ashore. In that second phase, Ian, you go after the maritime capability, the boat repair facility, the ammunition dumps, the docking stations, the pier structure.
Those are missile responses largely.
Correct.
Why hasn't, again, it's been months.
I have no idea.
Why haven't they done that?
I have no idea.
If you were in there, would you be strongly recommending
100%.
that? Already?
Absolutely.
Months ago.
So
is this just incapability?
I think it is a desire on the part of at the time, the Biden administration to avoid a wider war. They are concerned that going after this proxy infrastructure will inexorably lead to a major conflict with Iran. I reject that. You can't be scared of your own shadow, and we can't cede 20% of the global shipping chains to the Houthis. So phase two, you go after the maritime.
You got 3 more phases, though.
I do.
Okay, be quick.
I will. Third phase, you go after Houthi targets, but you don't confine it to the maritime. You go after their command and control. You go after their leadership. You go after their ground capability because they value that. They're still in a civil conflict. So you expand the strike zone. Step 4, you sever the links between Iran and the Houthis. They're largely maritime. You put effectively a blockade zone, and you could cut that off. And phase 5, most controversially, if none of that works, phase 5, you go after Iran. And here, I'm not saying jets whistling over Tehran, but you start going after Iranian warships that are operating, providing intelligence and support to the Houthis in the Red Sea. You go after Iranian maritime intelligence gathering platforms.
So you believe that a significant, this is what one could do, but I'm hearing that this is what you believe should be done, a significant military escalation by the United States in the region.
I recommend that.
Because deterrence is just not working.
Correct. I'm all for working your way up the vertical ladder of escalation. I just think we've been stuck in phase 1. And your point, we're shooting down $300 drones with $1 million standard missiles. And by the way, it's not just the merchant ships that are at risk. Sooner or later, one of those drones is going to hit a Navy warship. We're going to have a USS Cole-like event, and then we're off to the races anyway. So my view, let's work up that ladder of escalation, signaling the whole way, but we have to do it in a resolute fashion.
And let me clarify one thing. I mean, you talked about the convoys that need to protect ships, and again, there's already a lot of that happening, but you are not at any of these stages talking about the requirement of American boots on the ground fighting in the region.
Nothing I just said should imply that. And I think that is a pretty good place to draw a line for the United States, that we can do everything we've just talked about from the sea, from the air, cyber, special forces, operating from the sea, going after Houthi maritime. At this stage, I don't think we need to put American troops on the ground. And by the way, if we need some troops on the ground, talk to the IDF.
No, the Israeli Defense Forces.
Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to now pivot. You've written a lot recently, including a very fun speculative novel, 2054, about where technology is going and how that changes national security for the United States. And most of this book's set in the United States. This one as opposed to the last one in Asia, which was a lot of fun. Of course, nukes were popping off in the last one, Jim, so I was worried about that.
This is a much more benign book.
It is more benign, though it's a little dystopian in terms of a lot of things you see on the ground in the United States. We're not going to go there. I want to talk, though, about how technology is changing fighting in the United States.
Sure.
Because on the one hand, I see like a lot of traditional military industrial complex companies that have been around for a very long time. They put together very expensive, state-of-the-art, sort of bomber systems, jet fighter systems, submarine systems. Then I see new companies like Palantir and Anduril and others that are like, saying we're the state of the art for the future.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I also see AI and both the Chinese and non-state actors that are moving faster than an eye blink, changing the nature of warfighting. So talk to me a little bit about not 2054, but the next, let's say, administration, the next 4 years. How is warfighting going to change? How is America's national security posture and vulnerabilities going to change?
Let's start with Ukraine. We're watching warfare shapeshift in front of our eyes. On the one hand, you have World War I. You have trenches, blood, guts, hand-to-hand fighting, waves of troops
lines that
massacred,
aren't
static, everything. It's World War I. And what's the coin of the realm? Artillery, shells, thousands of them. So that's the World War I piece. But on that same battlefield, as we know, is artificial intelligence, unmanned systems. The Russian Black Sea Fleet started with 60 ships, of which almost half are sunk or badly damaged.
Which is crazy, because Ukraine doesn't have a navy.
You stole my punchline.
Oh, was that your line?
Yeah, sure. Ukraine doesn't even have a navy. They did it all with unmanned vehicles, exquisite intelligence. And what was the first ship they sank? The
biggest one.
The
Moskva.
Moskva took it down with 400 sailors, a remarkable feat of arms. So you've got these competing visions in front of you. How do we think about it?
What's the
here
chances
in the
that
United
Putin
States?
thought he was going to lose the Black Sea Fleet when he started the war?
Zero.
Zero, right?
I thought that was one of his ace cards that he would use to strangle the Ukrainian economy. Guess what? Hasn't happened. The Black Sea Fleet is now cowering in the eastern Black Sea. They're scared to get anywhere near Ukraine, and the Ukrainian economy is flowing just fine, all of its exports. So what should we do about it? How do we think about it? Here's our problem so often in geopolitics and life. We want to think of everything as an on and off switch. Everything's black and white. It's very simple. So one could say, oh yeah, the U.S. military needs to absolutely do unmanned and special forces and cyber and get rid of all those expensive platforms. That's not the right image. It's not an on and off switch. It's a rheostat. You dial it in. And so over the next 4 years, I think quite significantly, using the lessons of Ukraine, you're going to see the dial of that rheostat move, less spending on those big conventional platforms, more spending And the good news is a lot of it's less expensive on cyber, on unmanned, on space, on lightweight maritime systems, on a U.S. Marine Corps.
Well, that's good news for U.S. defense spending. That's not good news globally.
Correct.
Not at all.
No, not at all. And what you need to think about in this context is a new triad that's emerging. We think of triad as the strategic
nuclear.
Triad, the nuclear. This is the new triad of warfare. It's unmanned systems. And people think, oh, drones. No, it's much bigger than that. It's unmanned. That's satellites. That's long dwell surveillance. It's Reaper, Predator attack drones.
Submarines.
It all the way to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
That tranche of unmanned is one leg of this new triad. The next leg is cyber and artificial intelligence. We can dive in deeper on that. And the third leg of the triad are special forces. And I want to make a point. Special forces we tend to think of as Rambo and Navy SEALs putting red dots on people's foreheads. That's part of it. But special forces to me are elite, exquisitely trained humans doing very difficult one-off tasks. So that can be a SEAL, it can be a Marine Raider, it can also be a cyber expert, it can be a drone pilot, it can be an artificial intelligence engineer, those kind of special forces. We are going to need less of these huge standing armies, which are incredibly expensive. By far the most expensive thing in the U.S. Armed Forces are personnel.
So that being the case, how long before the Ukraine war or another war like it would no longer have a World War I component, would no longer have trench warfare, front lines, and thousands of soldiers fed into this relentless meat grinder?
I think the chances of a Ukraine II kind of battle are relatively low because of what's happening in Ukraine, because the world is observing it and watching that shape shifting. And then secondly, because the obvious potential conflict, which I write about in 2030 for the novel,
the previous book,
is U.S. and China. And we are not going to need a 1 million-person army to contend with China, but we are going to need that new triad of warfare.
In the next 5 years, is it more or less likely that the United States, as a comparative power projection to other adversaries in the world, does it get comparatively stronger or weaker, and why?
I think we will continue to be the preeminent nation at projecting power. And the reason is because we've invested in it enormously. Even if you look at China, which would be the other nation that is consciously developing the ability to
including
do
major
that.
Nuclear capabilities.
Nuclear capability, satellite systems, building bases. China today has, you probably know this, one base. It's in Djibouti. There are hundreds of U.S. bases all around the world. Those bases go back to Alfred Thayer Mahan over 100 years ago. The forwards coaling stations of Mahan are these bases today. So I think the U.S. will continue to be preeminent. China will make a play to do it. Russia, the lights are going to go out, I think, because of Putin's folly in Ukraine. And I don't see another contending power. I don't see the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Venezuelans, the Cubans, the usual list of malactors.
But asymmetrical warfare from randos is going way up.
Correct. That's what you need to worry about. Back where we started this conversation, in particular, it's small group acts of terrorism. It's the ability to use weapons of mass disruption as well as weapons of mass destruction. And here cyber continues to be very dangerous.
Admiral James Stavridis, thanks again for joining the show.
What a pleasure, Ian.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Do you like what you heard? Of course you do. Why not make it official? Why don't you rate and review GZERO World? 5 stars, only 5 stars, otherwise don't do it. On Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends.